Zaporizhzhia. For many months, Moscow has regarded this place as the key gateway protecting the land corridor connecting Crimea with Donetsk. But for Kyiv, it is something entirely different. For Ukraine, Zaporizhzhia is the harshest testbed of modern warfare, where information, drones, and speed determine who survives. And now, that testbed is changing. Along a combat line roughly 30 kilometers long from Huliaipole to Uspenivka, once promoted by Russia as the most solid defensive axis in the south, the map is shifting. In the period from February 11 to 15, 2026, Ukraine claimed to have recaptured approximately 91 kilometers quintrade of territory in Zaporizhzhia province and retaken 5 settlements along the conflict line. This is Kyiv's most significant advance on the southern front since the 2023 counteroffensives. Recall 2025. The Huliaipole axis was once where Russia achieved its highest advance rate, around 297 meters per day, according to battlefield analyses. Moscow called that momentum. But 297 meters per day is not a breakthrough. It is slow crawling in a war of attrition. And then that rhythm stalled. What is disorienting Russia in Zaporizhzhia is not some miraculous new weapon system, not a NATO brigade appearing over the horizon. It is their gradual loss of real-time battlefield visibility. To understand why that matters, first look at the map of southern Ukraine. Then look at how the supply lines connecting Tokmak to Russian rear areas are now shrouded in a digital fog. So what happens when a modern army loses its information advantage right as it prepares for the 2026 summer campaign? In the period from February 11 to 15, 2026, Zaporizhzhia became the focal point. In just a few days, Ukraine claimed to have recaptured roughly 91 kilometers quadrate of territory and retaken 5 settlements along the 30-kilometer combat line, stretching from Huliaipole to Uspenivka and down to Zaporizhzhia. To understand why, first look at how Ukraine advanced. Kyiv did not seek a steel fist like in 2022, did not rely on massed mechanized formations charging straight ahead. Instead, the Ukrainian military chose a surgical model, dispersed attacks across multiple points to deprive Russia of the ability to predict the main thrust, peeling off small defensive clusters with fast mobile units, using UAVs to identify the weakest links, and then striking precisely there, cutting the short supply lines Russia depended on to sustain its defensive positions. Those narrow dirt roads running between villages, roads Russia once considered unimportant, have now become Kyiv's priority targets. When one small supply line disappears, an entire Russian platoon gets isolated. When 2 disappear, a defensive cluster must withdraw. And when 3 disappear, the entire defensive sector is forced to contract to avoid complete encirclement. This is a push-bend-squeeze strategy rather than a stab-straight-penetrate-deep one. Each advance is only a few hundred meters, but those few hundred meters are taken at the right place, right time, and right weak point, forcing the Russians to retreat more than Ukraine forces them to. The Huliaipole-Uspenivka axis is especially sensitive. In 2025, this was the place Russia boasted about achieving its fastest advance rate, around 297 meters per day, according to independent battlefield analyses. For Moscow, that 297 meters/day figure was seen as drive. But when placed in the historical context of warfare, where World War I soldiers amid mud and shelling sometimes advanced faster, it becomes a brutal reminder of the real limits of the current Russian army. And it is precisely in the area they considered one of their rare bright spots that Ukraine has seized back the initiative. When looking at other fronts, the contrast becomes even clearer. In many directions, Russia advanced only 15 to 70 meters per day, a speed even lower than many battles of the previous century, when there were no UAVs overhead, no electronic warfare, no real-time command networks. In 2024, Russia captured about 3,604 kilometers quadrate. In 2025, they increased that to about 4,831 kilometers quadrate. But at what cost? Total casualties since February 2022 are estimated at roughly 1.2 million. In 2025 alone, Russian casualties were estimated at about 415,000, meaning over 35,000 soldiers removed from combat each month in one way or another. Those numbers turn every progress Russia boasts about into historical irony. Meanwhile, Ukraine's quiet strategy in Zaporizhzhia creates effectiveness through a different logic, not recapturing hundreds of square kilometers in one blow, but adjusting the salience and re-entrance of the front line, shrinking the pockets Russia relies on, forcing the exhausted opponent to disperse already strained forces, and most importantly, slowing the entire preparation rhythm for Russia's 2026 summer plans. Moscow wanted a summer of momentum. Kyiv is turning it into a summer of stagnation. And every square kilometer recaptured in Zaporizhzhia is not a symbolic victory for television. It is a calculated disruption of Russia's own campaign ambitions. But to understand why these small but precise advances in Zaporizhzhia have left Russia reeling so badly, we must look at another war unfolding, more silent, more precise, and far more ruthless: Starlink. On the modern battlefield, Starlink is not just a satellite internet network. It is the central nervous system of Ukraine's entire command structure. It provides real-time communication between dispersed units. It transmits live video from reconnaissance UAVs to command posts in seconds. It allows artillery crews to adjust fire with deviations of just a few meters. One Ukrainian officer described it succinctly: "Without Starlink, we fight like 2014. With Starlink, we fight like 2030. What Moscow never anticipated was that part of its own army, through black market channels and smuggling routes, had come to rely on unauthorized Starlink terminals to maintain stable bandwidth for FPV drones and reconnaissance teams. While operational, it enabled them to control UAVs remotely, transmit high-resolution imagery, and coordinate artillery more accurately. But then the system was disabled. In an instant, what Russia thought was a silent advantage turned into a deadly void. Russian drones suddenly lost connection. Control signals became jittery, delayed, or completely lost. Frontline units were forced back to military radios, an outdated technology that Ukraine can jam in minutes with electronic warfare deployment. Russian reaction times increased. Attacks became sluggish and unsynchronized. Artillery no longer received precise coordinates. If on the visible battlefield Russian forces were pushed back hundreds of meters, on the invisible battlefield they were pushed back light years. And while Russia stumbles in that digital darkness, Ukraine deploys what it has built over 3 years, the find and kill model, or more precisely, ISR, find, televarsh, destroy. First, reconnaissance UAVs detect targets. Then, coordinate data is transmitted almost instantly via Starlink to artillery batteries or FPV units. And finally, the target is eliminated in mere tens of seconds, not hours, not minutes, seconds. Look at the numbers from December 2025. In just 1 month, Ukraine struck 107,000 targets with UAVs, a figure that redefines the entire concept of battlefield firepower. In the same month, 128 Russian air defense systems were destroyed, wiping out multiple layers of protection Moscow still believed were impenetrable. And then the target for 2026, 50,000 Russian soldiers removed from combat each month via drones. An ambitious goal, but with current operational scale entirely feasible. Because Ukraine does not just use drones, they produce them like heavy industry. In 2025, Ukraine is estimated to have produced between 2.5 and 4.5 million UAVs depending on the source. And for 2026, the goal is 7 million, a number that sounds like science fiction until you look at the funding flow. Roughly $120 billion budgeted for capacity expansion, half from Ukrainian and European funds, the other half awaiting Allied support. That means every time Russia tries to build a new defensive line, Ukraine only needs to add another swarm of drones to peel it layer by layer. This is no longer a war of tanks and infantry. This is a war of sensors, bandwidth, and data speed. A war where a UAV platoon has destructive power equivalent to a 1990s mechanized brigade. For an American audience, this carries another meaning. Ukraine is showing the world the shape of warfare in 10, 20, even 30 years. Mass numbers do not win. No one has the advantage just because they own more tanks. Whoever sees first strikes first. Whoever processes data faster survives. And whoever loses their information network goes blind. That is exactly what is happening to Russia in Zaporizhzhia. While shells still explode, it is the data packets transmitted via low orbit and landing on the ground in an instant that truly decide the direction of the war. Welcome to networked warfare, and the United States, more than anyone else, understands that what is happening in Zaporizhzhia today will rewrite future combat doctrine. If what is happening in the skies over Zaporizhzhia is a revolution in how war is conducted, then what is happening in Uspenivka is a revolution in how front lines are shaped. Uspenivka, just a small dot on the map, is in reality a junction of multiple tactical logistics lines running along the eastern flank of Zaporizhzhia. From here, narrow dirt roads connect to Zaporizhzhia, run up to Huliaipole, and loop through other village clusters, forming the network Russia depends on to rotate ammunition, supplies, and troops. When Ukraine closed in on this area, they were not just advancing toward a village. They were advancing toward a linchpin of Russia's entire defensive system. Losing Uspenivka means Russia loses not just one position. They lose the ability to hold the zigzag defensive line they spent 2025 trying to reinforce. That front line is forced to straighten, contract, and when a front line is squeezed straight, it usually weakens. And to achieve that, Ukraine does not rely solely on traditional infantry or artillery. They rely on what has made the difference since the start of this counter-offensive phase: kill zones. According to defense analyses, in 2025 and into 2026, Kyiv has deployed UAV-saturated fire zones 5 to 10 kilometers deep in front of the front line, areas previously considered safe buffers where Russian forces could assemble, rotate, or reinforce. That concept no longer exists. There is no 15-kilometer safe zone, no place where a Russian platoon can concentrate for more than a few minutes without a reconnaissance UAV sweeping overhead. FPV, artillery guided by drone coordinates, and electronic warfare units combine into a multi-layered kill zone system. Reconnaissance drones detect movement. FPV drones dive to engage targets. Artillery blocks retreat routes or destroys transport vehicles. And if Russia tries to counter with its own UAVs, they are intercepted within a few hundred meters. It is in these kill zones that Russia pays the highest price. Places that were once assembly belts have become hunting grounds where Ukrainian UAVs seek every sign of life. Small trucks, once the backbone of tactical logistics, are destroyed the moment they appear. A Russian artillery battery can be located within 90 seconds and wiped out within 3 minutes. And when looking at the air defense system, the Zaporizhzhia area is also being placed under an anti-drone dome, a new shield developed by Ukraine in coordination with the UK. Small, fast, low-cost interceptor drones, controlled by mobile ground defense teams, continuously hunt Shahed-type and Lancet drones before they can reach their targets. The goal of this system is clear: eliminate threats before they cross the horizon, turning the airspace around Zaporizhzhia into a space where virtually every flying object is tracked. And it is sorely needed, because in 2025, Russia launched a total of 54,538 Shahed-type UAVs toward Ukraine, with peak months averaging up to 203 per day, a metal rain aimed at paralyzing infrastructure and disrupting Kyiv's operational rhythm. But Kyiv did not let that happen. Instead of merely defending, Ukraine began doing what traditional military forces rarely achieve in wartime: redesigning the battlefield. They turned gaps into dead zones, Russian small logistics lines into choke points, and settlements along the front line into flexible defensive links. Zaporizhzhia is no longer a place where both sides grapple over fields. It is where UAV networks, artillery, air defense, and electronic warfare coalesce into a killing ecosystem, a living structure that reacts quickly and continuously adapts to Russian movements. What Moscow once saw as a strategic buffer has turned into a trap stretching dozens of kilometers. And the big question for an American audience is, if Ukraine can achieve this with a limited war budget, what happens when it receives stable, long-term, predictable support? Zaporizhzhia is showing the world the answer. A battlefield where data and firepower merge, where small villages decide the fate of an entire campaign season, and where every square kilometer is recaptured not just with blood, but with 21st century technology and strategic thinking. The Russian army is entering 2026 with a level of losses that would make even World War II great powers shudder in comparison. According to independent CSIS estimates, Russian soldiers killed since February 2022 range from 275,000 to 325,000, including wounded, missing, and permanently removed due to long-term injuries. Total casualties approach 1.2 million. Those numbers do not just describe an army that is exhausted, they describe a nation eroding its own future. And behind those cold figures are structural causes that the Zaporizhzhia battlefield exposes more clearly than ever. One of those causes is Russia's logistics system. Reports from multiple independent sources show that about 5.2% of Russian soldiers die because they are not evacuated in time, an unusually high rate in modern warfare, where forward medicine and armored transport usually keep survival rates much higher. In many cases, Russian troops lack basic equipment, low-quality body armor, outdated communications gear, even shortages of standard NATO-grade first aid supplies. When you place that in the context of the kill zones Ukraine has designed, where a Russian soldier can be exposed in seconds and hit by an FPV drone in a minute, those casualty rates are no longer surprising. They are the inevitable result of a system pushed to its limits. But Russia's damage is not limited to the battlefield and personnel. It extends into the economy. According to IMF projections, Russia's growth in 2026 will be only about -6 to -8%, a near stagnant level for a nation waging total war. Even more striking is that nearly 50% of Russia's federal budget is now allocated to defense, a ratio that reflects desperation more than strength. Russia is draining its treasury to gain every kilometer of land, yet in return they advance only 15 to 70 meters per day on many fronts, a speed even slower than many prolonged battles of World War I and II, where soldiers had to cross terrain without modern technology obstructing them. When you advance 70 meters in a day and lose hundreds of people to do it, that is not strategy. That is collapse disguised by enlarged maps in the Kremlin briefing room. And precisely because that advance rate is so slow, Russia must cling to the narrative of capturing land as the sole proof that the military campaign still has momentum. But that story holds only on paper. On the battlefield, they pay for it, with a casualty rate no modern nation can sustain long-term. While Ukraine redesigns the battlefield with drones, data, and flexible command networks, Russia tries to crush its opponent by throwing people into the fire in a 20th century model. The result: Ukraine only needs to push lightly in Zaporizhzhia, peel away logistics, create kill zones, strike Uspenivka, and an entire section of the Russian front is forced to contract. Because when survivability drops, logistics weaken, the economy slows, and advance speed freezes. Every meter of land Russia gains is actually a longer strategic retreat. And when a military campaign begins to slip off course, the first reaction of a regime accustomed to control is not to correct mistakes on the battlefield, but to edit the narrative. Russia enters 2026 with a defensive information strategy no less than its military one. Change the frame, change the target, change the cause, but never change who is responsible. In every official statement, Moscow now describes the war in Ukraine not as a special military operation, but as an existential confrontation with NATO. Ukraine's advances in Zaporizhzhia that cost Russia the initiative are never mentioned. Instead, the story is that the West has pushed Russia into a corner and forced Moscow to defend itself against global hostility. When reality does not side with them, the Kremlin rewrites that reality. Intensified domestic censorship follows. Voices criticizing the war are silenced, independent journalists are threatened or exiled. Social media is tightly controlled by Roskomnadzor. News of casualties numbers the world analyzes daily is replaced in Russia with staged reports where everything is proceeding according to plan. State media calls 200,000 troop losses Western fake information and describes 70 meters last day advances as sustainable strategic achievements. And as usual, when there is no technological explanation for the shortfall, Moscow blames the West. Russia's loss of access to unauthorized Starlink devices is not described as the natural consequence of relying on technology they do not own, but turned into an example of America's technological conspiracy to weaken the Russian army. Ukraine destroying 128 air defense systems in 1 month is not due to Ukraine's growing capability, but because the West supplied secret technology. Even the failure at Uspenivka is attributed by Russian media to the nature of global confrontation, rather than admitting they were outmaneuvered by Ukraine's organization and reaction speed. But beneath that propaganda layer is a clear strategy. This is not just a war over territory. It is a war to erode American and European support for Ukraine. If Western public opinion begins to believe that aid makes no difference, that Ukraine cannot win, that Russia has an irreversible advantage, then Moscow hopes Washington will slow its support. Information warfare thus becomes a parallel front. Every Russian television segment, every staged video of Russian soldiers advancing, every assertion that NATO is behind all their failures, all aim to sow doubt about the effectiveness of American aid. But battlefield truth does not change because of a television report. No statement can hide the 91-kilometer queried Ukraine has just recaptured. No propaganda narrative can erase the fact that Russia is losing real-time battlefield visibility. And no slogan can turn 15 to 70 meters day advances into strategic victory. What is blinding Russia on the battlefield is not Abrams, not F-16s. Those may play important roles in later stages of the war, but at this moment, what is choking Russia's offensive capability is something they do not see, do not admit, and cannot fix quickly: the break in connectivity. Their command network is torn apart by electronic warfare. Their drones can no longer maintain stable bandwidth. Gaps between units grow larger, and in those gaps, Ukrainian drones, dense, persistent, data-guided, are filling in, hunting, wearing down formations one by one. Kill zones expand in front of the line, stretching 5 to 10 kilometers, turning every Russian force assembly effort into tactical suicide. And then there is something no patriotic slogan can fool: the math of war. You cannot advance while losing 35,000 troops per month. You cannot maintain momentum when nearly half your defense budget goes just to replace losses. You cannot call 70 meters day a victory, even if state television repeats it hourly. Zaporizhzhia, more than anywhere else, reveals the truth Moscow fears most. Ukraine still holds the vast majority of internationally recognized territory. Russia is advancing at the slowest rate in modern warfare history, and in an attrition war based on information, industrial capacity, and precision, Russia does not hold the advantage. For an American audience, the final message is simple: aid does not prolong war endlessly. Aid is helping Ukraine rewrite the 21st century model of warfare, a model the United States will face in future conflicts. And if Zaporizhzhia teaches us anything, it is this: support in the right place can redraw the entire map. Stay tuned for the next battlefield update, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the analysis Moscow definitely does not want you to hear.